Albert Camus' novel The Plague is a work of fiction. It was published in 1947 and relates the narrative of a disease that spread across the French Algerian city of Oran through the eyes of a narrator. Until the start of the last chapter, Chapter 5 of Part 5, the narrator is unknown. The novel offers a picture of life in Oran as viewed through the author's singular absurdist perspective. The Plague is a novel about a bubonic plague crisis that occurred in the 1940s in the French Algerian port city of Oran. The unidentified first-person narrator primarily pursues Dr. Bernard Ruz. Ruz observes a huge influx of dying rats throughout the town, and soon tens of thousands of rats are dying in the open. The public becomes worried, and the government eventually arranges for rat corpses to be cremated on a daily basis. M. Michel, the caretaker for Dr. Ruz's office building, has a weird fever and dies soon after the rat plague has passed. The sickness appears to be bubonic plague, according to Dr. Ruz and his colleague Dr. Kastel. They plead with the government to act, but the authorities delay until the death toll is so high that the pandemic is unavoidable. Finally, the gates are shut and Oran is quarantined. The villagers experience emotions of exile and desire for absent loved ones as a result of their unexpected isolation, with each individual believing that their pain is unique. A Jesuit priest, Father Panelix, speaks, claiming that the epidemic is a God's wrath for Oran's crimes. Raymond Rambert, a foreign journalist, attempts to leave Oran and reunite with his wife in Paris but is hindered by bureaucracy and the dependability of the criminal underground. Cottard, a guy who committed an unknown crime in the past and has since lived in continuous paranoia, assists him in his efforts. Cottard is the sole resident who welcomes the epidemic since it brings the rest of the population down to his level of fear and isolation, plus it allows him to make a little fortune smuggling. Meanwhile, Ruz battles the disease with the help of Jean Theroux, another Oran tourist, and Joseph Grand, an elderly municipal clerk who misses his ex-wife and fights every day with the opening sentence of a novel he is attempting to write. Theroux forms an anti-plague sanitation league, which attracts a large number of volunteers. When Rambert discovers that Dr. Ruz is also separated from his wife, he resolves to stay and battle the plague. After a few months, the population understands the epidemic as a national tragedy and loses their selfishness in their suffering. Everyone becomes tired and dejected, and the death toll has reached such a high level that the authorities have no choice except to cremate the dead. The disease strikes the little son of M. Othen, the stern local magistrate, and Ruz and his friends, including Father Panelix, watch him suffer and die. Panelix is shocked by the death of the kid, and he gives a second speech, this time stating that the horrors of the epidemic offer only two options: believe everything about Christianity, or deny everything. Panelix becomes ill and dies soon after, despite the fact that he shows no signs of the epidemic. Theroux tells Ruz about how he spent his life battling the death sentence and fighting the plague in all of its manifestations. The two men go swimming for a short break before returning to work. Grand catches the disease but recovers unexpectedly. Other patients begin to heal, and the pandemic begins to go away, but Theroux becomes sick. He falls victim to the illness after a hard battle. The residents of the community gradually rediscover their faith and begin to cheer. Only Cottard is disturbed by the end of the disease, and when the town's gates reopen, he goes insane and begins firing a gun into the street at random until he is captured. Grand finishes his manuscript and writes a letter to his ex-wife. Rambert's wife arrives at Oran with him, but Dr. Ruz finds that his wife has passed away in the sanatorium. The residents immediately resume their daily routines, attempting to maintain the impression that nothing has changed. Dr. Ruz exposes himself as the narrator of the journal, which he composed as a memorial to the plague victims and the workers' hardships. He understands that the plague's success is just temporary, since the bacillus germ may remain dormant for years. Whereas in the stranger first-person narration is primarily a device of characterization, used to portray an alien figure's disconcertingly remote and hollow personality. In The Plague it is a device of narrative realism, used to reduce devastatingly incomprehensible events to a human, hence believable, scale by portraying the way these events are seen by a representative group of ordinary citizens. The heart of the novel is the depiction of the various ways in which individuals react to the fear and isolation imposed by this sudden state of siege, in which the invading army is invisible. To convey the variety of responses to such an extreme and concentrated crisis in human affairs, Camus deliberately eschews the convenient device of the omniscient narrator. Making the depiction of every event and scene an eyewitness account in some form, the spoken words of reports or dialogues, the written words of letters or private diaries, and, as the main device, the written record of the daily observations of the novel's main character, Dr. Rose. In The Plague, however, Camus proposes the paradox that when death is a manifestation of the absurd, it galvanizes something in a person's spirit that enables the individual to join with others to fight against death and thus give meaning and purpose to life. From evil may come happiness, this novel seems to suggest. It is a painful irony of the human condition that individuals often discover their own capacities for courage and for fraternal affection, that is, for happiness, only if they are forced by the threat of evil to make the discovery. Readers frequently interpret The Plague as a symbol of the French occupation. There is little doubt that the book was a tribute to his colleagues of the resistance and all those who lived under the rule of totalitarian forces. Characters such as Rose, Tarot, Rambert and Grand bear striking parallels with resistance fighters, whilst Panelix symbolizes the Church's attitude to the war as a punishment for sin. France and Oran are sealed off from the world, food rationed, curfews imposed, and electricity scarce. Police lurk everywhere, hungrily patrolling the streets. The celebrations at the end are similar to that of the liberation of Paris. Yet the plague is a natural catastrophe for which men have no responsibility. It is a cruel and impersonal epidemic in stark contrast to the human brutality of the occupation forces. Symbolism works throughout the plague on a variety of different levels. It is an allegory with a number of strands whilst also being a personal statement of belief. The plague itself can represent whatever the reader finds most objectionable or unendurable in human life, and is therefore subject to an infinite variety of symbolic interpretations. Metaphorically, the plague represents the face of death confronting the inhabitants with their own mortality and dealing with the consequences. In this way, the plague represents anything that, like death, negates human effort or poisons the joy of living. Often referred to as an abstraction, it threatens man's happiness and anything that is beyond their comprehension. Whilst the plague itself is not a direct representation of the absurd, the extreme circumstances provoke the inhabitants of Oran to an experience of the absurd by confronting them unexpectedly with death. Victims are compelled to come to terms with the most fundamental and basic conditions of life. The plague also represents an interior infection, with the power of evil that can take firm hold of the human heart and make men enter into complicity with the exterior plague. This infection leads to lies, deceit, and duplicity, all the means by which a man may be contaminated and tricked into complicity with a world based on injustice. In this way the plague is an evil that we all carry within us, and the analogy with the occupation forces is therefore all the more plausible. The suggestion that we possess an inner taint that corresponds to the cosmic disaster of the plague, working in collusion with it, the actions of the occupation forces are more explicable. Tarot, however, is the only character to refer to an inner plague. To revolt against the plague is to deny any desire to contribute to the misfortunes of men and to comfort them in the miseries that may befall them. The plague was a significant milestone in Camus' work, as it marks a break away from his cycle of the absurd. It tells the story of Dr. Rose and his attempt with some other citizens of Oran to stop a plague which hits the city. The plague was Camus' first major success and, although he objected to the label throughout his life, is considered to be a classic in existentialist literature.